In the century or so after Mozart's death, Così fan tutte was the least often performed of his mature operas. As the great Mozart scholar Edward J. Dent explained, Lorenzo Da Ponte's libretto was denounced throughout the 19th century as being intolerably stupid, if not positively disgusting. But in this century, it's been recognized as, in Dent's words, as perfect a libretto as any composer could desire, and the score as the most exquisite work of art among Mozart's operas. There are 21 recordings of it in the current catalogue for John Steane to compare and contrast in this week's Building a Library. Così fan tutte was first produced in Vienna in 1790. It's the last of the three great comedies which Mozart wrote with Da Ponte. Unlike the first two, it has an original plot, supposedly inspired by a real-life event in Vienna not long before, though that's rather hard to believe. The cast of characters is small and symmetrical. Ferrando, tenor, and Guglielmo, baritone, are two young Neapolitan officers engaged to two sisters, Fiordiligi, soprano, and Dorabella, mezzo-soprano usually. Don Alfonso, baritone going on bass, is an elderly bachelor friend of the two officers. Despina, soprano, or sometimes mezzo, is the maid to the two ladies. To disprove Don Alfonso's cynical proposition that women are incapable of fidelity, Ferrando and Guglielmo pretend that they've been called away to the wars. Then they return, disguised as Albanian noblemen, and each woos the other's fiancée. They don't have much luck at first, but with Despina helping them carry out a series of increasingly wild stratagems, they eventually meet with more success than they'd bargained for. Here's John Steane.
Well, I suppose the first thing we have to do is decide what we're going to call it. Così fan tutte it is, but nobody says all that, and what they do say is così, or even cosy, I'm afraid. Only I know there are people who get frightfully upset about it, and point out that così means thus, and you can't go round talking about Mozart's thus. But like so many of the things they say you can't do, of course you can, and nobody's much the worse for it. So, for the next 40 minutes or so, Mozart's thus it shall be, and for the thusness of it, here's the latest. Simon Rattle with the Orchestra of the Age of Enlightenment at the start of a concert performance at Birmingham in 1995 on EMI, and he does fair make it whiz along. Too fast? Well, anything he can do, Arnold Erstmann and his Drottningholm people can do faster. Of course, it's a smallish orchestra and theatre that are involved here, and somehow the singers manage to cope, though one always marvels, just a trifle apprehensively, that they can indeed do so. The Drottningholm Così under Erstmann on L'Oiseau Lyre. It is very fast, but it's exhilarating too, everybody on their toes, the tenor, Josta Winberg, sounding slightly taken aback to find his triplets have to move quite so quickly, but settling in sure enough as the rest of them do. Tom Krauser and Carlos Feller are the others. Even so, there is a certain breathlessness about it, and you've only to relax the tempo a very little to keep the spirits high in this opening trio, but to seem in less of a rush about it.
La mia sorella capace non è, ed è quanto bella il cielo alla te, ed è tanto bella il cielo a te. La mia fior dirigi a dirmi non sa, quale ne credo costanza e metà, quale ne credo costanza e metà. Voi grigi già grigi, ex cathedra falco, ma tali litigi finiscano qua, ma tali litigi finiscano qua. Avendo già avete che il fine per fondo, provarcelo che si avete onestà. Poi come lasciamo, o come vogliamo, o fuori la strada, o fuori la strada, o fuori la strada, non chiami l'amistà.
Schulte, his second and quite recent recording on Decca. The throaty tenor is Frank Lepardo, Olaf Baer, the good Guglielmo, Michele Pertusi, the Alfonso. Almost all of the modern recordings, that is, of the last 10 to 15 years, set a quick tempo compared with what we used to have from, say, Carl Böhm. One consequence is that I do find it very difficult now to be content with the old speeds, as, like most listeners nowadays, I imagine, I also do with the weight of a full orchestra. It occurs to me that quite a large part of the exercise in recording Così is a shedding of lumber, in texture, tempo, and, if necessary, tenors. Also, in the matter of acoustics.
Ciascun lo dice, dove sia, nessun lo sa. La felice l'ora bella, la felice violini, l'ora bella violini, la felice l'ora bella. Non è questa, non è quella, non fu mai, non vi sarà, non vi sarà, non vi sarà. E la fede delle femmine come la rama felice, la felice, l'ora bella, l'ora bella, la felice. E vi sia ciascun lo dice, l'ora bella, dove sia, come sia, l'ora bella.
That's part of a generally delightful performance with nicely lightened orchestral sound. The Scottish Chamber Orchestra under Sir Charles Mackerras on Telarc. But it is a very reverberant acoustic, the Usher Hall in Edinburgh, almost cathedral-like, and not the setting that's wanted here. Textually, it's liberated enough. You heard Jerry Hadley there decorating his wondrous Dorabella, and that would never have been allowed in the old days. Yet it's stylish, in keeping with what we understand of the practice in Mozart's time, and discarding the lumber of strict literalism. That, too, the freedom of ornamentation, is a feature of most modern recordings. But the modern maestros may also bring their own lumber with them, sometimes in the form of the bright idea. Nicholas Arnoncourt on Teldec is full of bright ideas. For instance, he's noticed that with age, men's voices tend not to fall to a deep bass, as convention has it, but to rise. And therefore it's all right to have young Thomas Hampson to represent the elderly Don Alfonso, but it doesn't really work like that.
Vorrei dirti corpo d'oro, sul parletto la troppa, o la voce uscir non può, ma mi resta mezza qua. Che caro, oh che gran fatalità, ma ripeto, non si può, non si può. Oh, di voi, niente, oh, di voi, niente, oh, di voi, niente, di voi, niente.
Hampson acts up very well there as the bearer of bad tidings, but it's obstinately the voice of a young man. It's Guglielmo in disguise. To establish the seniority of Don Alfonso, you probably have to sacrifice something in the way of vocal allure, as John Eliot Gardiner did when he cast Carlos Feller in the role. Feller, you remember, was in the Erstmann recording, already something of a veteran even in 1984. Now here he is, 8 years later, no beauteous to tone, but much more identifiably Don Alfonso. Carlos Feller with Gardiner in a live performance from Ferrara, very aptly, as that's where the sisters of this eventful day's activity are said to have come from. Now Gardiner, too, is a man with ideas. On the whole, I think his work out better than Arnoncourt's, though some of them are rather drastic as far as casting is concerned. For he argues that the girls, Fiordiligi and Dorabella, are not really, not in the first half anyway, individuals at all. They're generic girl, twin profiles of one face, and so should be cloned in voice. It's a rather lovely feature of that performance of the first Act One quintet that the voices of Fiordiligi and Dorabella are so well matched that, intertwining, they appear as one, as the joint purveyors of a single continuous melodic line. But I wouldn't want it to become general practice. For one thing, it puts something of a burden on the soprano Dorabella, whose tessitura is significantly lower than Fiordiligi's, and for another, it'd deprive us of all those lovely and unlikely combinations of unmatched voices that have served us so well in the past. Montserrat Caballé and Janet Baker. No twin pairings or profiles there, and it works like magic. That's in the Sir Colin Davis recording of 1974 on Philips, and it's one to remember. Besides, if Gardiner's cloning had prevailed in the past, we wouldn't have had all those marvellous mezzo Dorabellas, and Sophie von Otter, Christa Ludwig, Brigitte Fassbender, and, of course, Dame Janet herself. Again, the Davis recording, Janet Baker in Dorabella's Smanie Implacabili. And if you say, but that isn't a girl at all, it's a woman, and it isn't in the spirit of light comedy, which is what Così is, well, that may not inevitably mean that there's something wrong with the performance, but rather that there could just conceivably be something questionable about the idea to which it's supposed to conform. There is, of course, a very rich heritage of recorded Cosìs, right back to the first of all, the famous Glyndebourne set of 1935 under Fritz Busch. And if anybody still thinks that in those days they just sang, just, what's the expression, stood and delivered, well, they'll find here as lively an acted performance as any on record.
Voi ridete, certo ridiamo, ma così avete, già lo sappiamo, ridete piano alla timpano, ridete piano, 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 alla timpano, sentissero, si guasterebbe tutto lo palo, si guasterebbe tutto lo palo, anche nel ridere, che fanno ridere, da dividere, come anche nel ridere, fanno ridere, da dividere,
In 1935, Hedel Nash, Willy Domgraf Fassbender, that's Brigitte's father, and John Brownlee. There are two transfers of this on CD, Pearl and EMI, and I was playing there from the EMI, which has more body and less surface. It's also on 2 CDs instead of 3. The women are Ina Suez, Louisa Hellitzgruber, and Irene Eisinger, who's very much the typical soubrette Despina, and she's very good at laughing as well. After the war came several that are still available. There's one on Decca from 1955 with Böhm conducting with Vienna Philharmonic, but really it's a po-faced, formal affair with nothing to match the vivacity of the pre-war Glyndebourne. Hear the so-called laughing trio again.
Di voi ridete, certo ridiamo, ma cosa avete? Camo sappiamo, ridete piano, parlate in mano, ridete piano, 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 parlate in mano, si sentissero, si basterebbe tutto da fare, si sarebbe tutta da far,
anche dal ridere,
fa ridere,
ma dividere,
che sullo ridere, quando si è sarebbe tutta,
anche dal ridere,
fa ridere,
ma dividere,
sullo ridere, quando si lo ridere fatto e le viste sempre torcerà, sempre torcerà,
Well, I don't know. The first line of that asks, "And are you laughing?" To which the answer should really be no. And then, "Laugh quietly," Don Alfonso says, to which there seems to be no answer at all. I think it's fearful old Böhm, not always a ray of sunshine in the studios. And I'm afraid I just slightly get that feeling now from his classic recording of 1962 on EMI. But we'll come to that in a moment. The earlier Böhm recording is on 2 CDs, but it's quite seriously cut. And as for the cast, it's an impressive list. The men there were Anton der Motor, Erich Kuntz, and Paul Schöffler, a substantial elder statesman Alfonso. The women, Elisa della Casa, whose pure voice and able technique still don't make a fior di legge of her. The young Christa Ludwig, and Emmy Loser as Despina. There's also a Phillips recording under Rudolf Moraut, with a kind of second team from Vienna headed by Teresa Stitch-Randall, but that's not in the running. Of course, the one from the 1950s, which is in the running, or would be if it weren't for the cuts, is the Karajan. This is with the Philharmonia Orchestra, who are at their peak, and it has such an excellent cast that I don't know quite whom to choose for illustration. But here's the tenor, Leopold Simonow. Something like the ideal timbre of a Mozart tenor there, clean cut and elegant, purely as sound, but apt and responsive in style also. Leopold Simonow, in the opening of Ferrando's aria in the EMI recording under Karajan from 1955. And that's another I shall be coming back to. The fior di legge of that recording is Elisabeth Schwarzkopf, who returned to the role in the studios 7 years later to sing under Carl Böhm. And here, too, the Ferrando, the tenor, is a special delight, and a rather unexpected one. It's Alfredo Kraus, who'd not sung in the opera before, and who came in at short notice, I think as a replacement for Nikolai Gedda. He may not sound quite so good after Simonow, but it was an inspired piece of casting.
Oh
Alfredo Kraus with Schwarzkopf in the EMI Böhm of 1962. And this is both a kingly performance, the Rolls Royce, the golden eagle among them all, and a reliable standby, because there's no weak link. And I think it's very probable that if I'd asked myself at the start of this survey, I might have thought the outcome a foregone conclusion. There's the masterly touch of a company of mature artists who have the whole thing in their system, and who have also, and this was producer Walter Legg's gift, a sense of special occasion. It's a performance with standards. Even now I've a slight feeling of apostasy, or perhaps of simply making life difficult, in not immediately announcing it as the winner, if we're thinking in those terms, the one sure recommendation. But there's still something about it, much enlivened, much humanized, something of the formality of that earlier Böhm, and along with the certainty that nothing will go wrong, or remotely let the performance down, there comes another feeling, that there will be no surprises, no risky quirk that might be endearing or exasperating, but would still lie within the spirit of this longest, most elaborate of operatic practical jokes. So, the classic Böhm is not going to be the inevitable choice, and for other reasons too. I find the transfer a little harsher than I would like, and the performance is still not quite complete. The cuts are mostly in recitative, but the little duet for Ferrando and Guglielmo in Act 1 goes, and so does Ferrando's aria A Loveggio. I take it that if you're buying one Così fan tutte for your collection, you do want to have it complete. And I wonder whether, to that, some of the old hands, who were brought up on the old recordings and have been perfectly happy with them, might not say, "Oh, come on, a bit of recitative here and there, what does that matter? It's a very delightful opera, but it's not as though every note is sacred writ. You don't have to be quite so prescriptive and judicial about it." Well, do you not? As someone who's just been through the opera, 21 times, I've rather come to the conclusion that these things do matter, that everything's there for a purpose, and what's missing is missed, like the step that isn't there. As for its delightfulness, well, delightful it is, but not with too much emphasis, please, on the light, as in light opera, light entertainment. It doesn't wear its heart on its sleeve, but it has one, and its wisdom, which isn't cynical, is imparted by stealth. But a recording to live with has got to have some sense of an exploration that goes beyond grace, charm, and wit. And it must have gaiety too, a holiday feeling of a day when all sorts of crazy things may happen, but at the end of which things will never be quite the same. So that's a tall order. It might take you to a recording I haven't mentioned so far, from 1962, Eugen Jochum conducting the Berlin Philharmonic on DG, with a distinguished cast, and getting both the heart and the light heart. But again there are cuts, and I'm afraid the Fior di Ligi, who's the enchanting Irmgard Seefried, really isn't up to the demands on the higher register of the voice and on the technique of florid singing. There's valour in the leap to those B-flats, but what about the triplet sequence? Answer, it isn't there, because she flattens out what should be triplets into more or less of a single note with a little wiggle every now and again. Here's what's written. Karel van Es, in a 1986 EMI recording under Bernard Haitink. Fior di Legge is a formidable role, and it needs the technique for those fast triplets and for the trills. Hear Montserrat Caballé at the end of the other aria, Per Pietà. You see, lovely sound, but no trills, only a sort of flutter. That was Caballé with Colin Davis. Now Van Es again. The trills are in place there, and they're needed. Without them, and the triplets and so forth, it's like the fine lady, Belinda, Millamant, or whoever, stepping forth to conquer with her ribbons left behind and her curls out of place. As for those recordings, I like the Davis very much indeed, but it has a more serious weakness in its Guglielmo, Vladimir Ganzaroli, and the Haitink recording, with Karel van Es as Fior di Legge and Dolores Ziegler as Dorabella, lacks zest and pace. For reasons of similar kinds, the accumulation of local weaknesses or a more pervasive want of some desirable quality, I'm passing over a number of versions. There's a Levine, a Mariner, both somewhat uneven, a Barenboim, very slow, a late Böhm, with some rather heavy stage action, and the monumental Klemperer, who makes it sound like Beethoven. More recently, there's a Sigismund Keuken and his Petite Bande, a respectable, unsparky performance. And admirable as many of the Naxos sets are, in addition to being good value for money, I wouldn't at all recommend their Così under Johannes Wildner. Nice, bright sound, decent playing, but very indifferent singing. For singing, though, and other qualities too, I couldn't possibly throw overboard that Karajan of 1955. Schwarzkopf, Nan Merriman and Sesto Bruscantini, achieving a heavenly lightness and fluidity in the Fair Winds and Prosperous Voyage trio. Karajan, 1955, and that's my bonus, historical choice. But for a modern recording, a complete text, enlightened if selective editorial care, and a good team, we're down to about 5. I'm going to jettison the Erstmann, too quick too often, and the Arnoncourt, too like an illustrated lecture with the conductor pointing out the interesting features. Next slide, please. There's the new rattle, which we sampled at the start. I find it very lively, and I can't say that Anne Murray's funny turn as Despina impersonating the doctor and the notary offends me, as it appears to have done several of its critics.
Tutto fatto, col contratto nuziale, il notaio sulle scale, il soltanto qui verrà. Può chiamarlo, eccolo qua.
Augurando di ogni bene, notaio per capire collosata voi sentieri, una reale dignità. Il contratto stipulato con le leggi ordinarie nelle forme giudiziarie, riposendo, poi sedendo, la voce leggera. Il contratto carne fatto si congiunge in matrimonio, fior di ligi
I must say I find that rather funny, and you can hear a little stir of amusement in the audience. It's a live performance, and again, unlike some, I don't find the occasional sounds of enjoyment and appreciation obtrusive at all. The Alfonso there, with Anne Murray, is Thomas Allen, one of the best. The singing as a whole isn't quite first class, though perhaps not much inferior to the one I'm about to choose, which isn't the Scholte. That has some splendid voices, those of Renée Fleming and Anne-Sophie von Otter for a start, and the playing and recording are first class. But it's this old thing with Scholte, and somehow more important with Così, because without it you get only, he says, a masterpiece of light entertainment. I can't sense that Scholte senses something beyond that, whereas I think Gardiner does. Amanda Rucroft, Rosa Mannion, Rainer Trost and Rodney Gilfrey are the lovers, and at the end of this performance you feel aware, as you should, of a gain in that strange department called the heart. The human heart itself is the subject, and comically but not superficially observed, it's a mystery. From time to time in a good Così, you look aside from the lights, the dresses, the comic show, and the music fleetingly and lightly intimates a mystery. I won't claim Gardiner's recording is beyond criticism. It, too, is of a live performance, but a staged one, and so a bit more obviously live than Rattles or Scholtes, which are from concerts. There are two brief bits of producer's business that could well have been eliminated from the recording. But, contrary to what's often said about such things, I myself found that the annoyance was greatest on first hearing, after which they're not much more tiresome than, what shall we say, a fly that alights on the back of your hand for a moment. No, it's a highly talented, well-felt, and otherwise well-judged performance, and it has just the right blend of seriousness and conviviality, even levity.
So do they all live happily ever after? The end of Mozart's Così fan tutte in John Steane's recommended recording, the one conducted by John Eliot Gardiner. Fiordiligi and Dorabella are sung by Amanda Rucroft and Rosa Mannion, Ferrando and Guglielmo by Rainer Trost and Rodney Gilfrey, Despina by Arian James, and Don Alfonso by Carlos Feller. The orchestra is the English Baroque Soloists, and the recording was made at a live performance in Ferrara in 1992. This is a 3-disc set on the Deutsche Grammophon Archiv label. The number is 437829. And John also recommends in the historical category the 1955 mono recording conducted by Herbert von Karajan with a cast headed by Elisabeth Schwarzkopf and Leopold Simoneau. That's EMI CHS 7 696352, a 3-disc set at mid-price.